Over the last 20 years, there's been a huge drop in the number of parties that people are going to. In 2003, the average American spent 3 hours a month partying. Today, that number is just 90 minutes a month. In just 2 decades, we shrank our social lives down to just half of what they used to be.
It's about as dramatic as any statistic that I have seen in the last few years. The death of partying has been absolutely tremendous.
But the drop-off isn't equal for all age groups, and that's what's really concerning. The drops among young people are staggering. Their decline in partying isn't 50%, it's nearly 70%. What happens to a generation of kids, these young people who are just starting to learn how to socialize, how to talk to people, how to date? What happens to these kids when they stop having a social life of their own?
In the year 2000, Harvard's Robert Putnam published a very famous book called Bowling Alone, where he said Americans seem to be retreating and socializing less and working on their social capital less and creating groups less. And he had all of this data suggesting that Americans were beginning to retreat between the 1970s and the early 2000s from the physical world. Some people at the time said that Robert Putnam was full of it. They said, you're totally crazy. You're forgetting the fact that the internet's going to come along and it's going to bring us all together. I'm talking about a social phenomenon that's happened entirely since the publication of Bowling Alone. So Robert Putnam rang the bell of declining American socialization. Then some people said he might be wrong. And then partying among 15 to 24-year-olds declined by 70%. So it's almost like the best way to frame this is not as one phenomenon, but like a recession on top of a recession. We were already seeing a retreat from the physical world, a retreat from social capital and socializing in the second half of the 20th century. And now that retreat has just accelerated in the last 20 years.
Okay, I want to get into the whys and what can be done about it in a second. But give me some examples of what young men and young women are doing if they're not going out and going to parties and socializing with other people.
Well, we know exactly what they're doing. They're hanging out on their phones, they're playing video games, they're watching TV, and that's basically it. It's screens and screens and more screens. We're spending more time with glass rather than spending time with people. And of course, the irony here is that I'm somewhat spending time with you, but I'm really just looking at my computer as we talk digitally, so I'm also looking through a pane of glass. And to be fair, I think this is a good time to say, it is difficult, I think, for some sociologists to determine how much of our social time is just being funneled into the internet and how much of this is us truly being more alone in front of our phones. One stat that I thought was very interesting is that Meta, in a recent FTC document, said that more than 90% of the time that people spend on Facebook or Instagram, they're not looking at their friends, they're essentially just watching videos. So even social media itself has essentially become television. I mean, a lot of this time, I think, that we are not spending with people that we know, we are spending with people that we don't know. There's a ton of academic evidence that suggests that while it is easy, especially these days, to be alone, right? To wake up and watch TV by yourself, to order the food, to come to your house, to work from home, to never get outside, to stay in your PJs. It is easy, it is convenient, but there is a curse to convenience. And when you ask a lot of these people whether they feel that their lives are meaningful, you find that a lot of the activities that are most convenient turn out to be least meaningful. Time with people, time outside of our home tends to be the most meaningful time that we spend in our lives. And that strikes me, therefore, as a great social tragedy if we're doing less of it.
Okay, let's get back to young people, because based on kind of, a traditional way of thinking, my parents' generation might well have said, wow, it's great that young kids are not spending time at parties. It's great that they're not out there drinking. And so I wanted to play you something. I want you to listen to something that Professor Scott Galloway, who I was speaking to a few weeks ago, said to me about this issue of partying. Take a listen.
40% of all nightclubs in London have closed down because young people don't have money and there's an anti-alcohol movement. I think the risk to the 25-year-old liver of alcohol is dwarfed by the risk of anxiety and social isolation. My advice to young people, and I'm being somewhat humorous here, is to go out, get out of the house more, drink more, and make a series of bad decisions that might pay off.
it's kind of this counterintuitive moment, right? Listening to Scott Galloway, and yes, he says he's being somewhat humorous, but the trade-off of, okay, maybe young people aren't out there partying, and you have stats on how they're drinking less. Teenagers are drinking less in particular than they used to. And I think every parent, I'm the parent of 4 children, would say, well, that's a very good thing. And I'm very glad my teenagers are not drinking, and they definitely should be home studying in their books. But actually what you seem to be suggesting, and Scott Galloway seems to be suggesting, is that there is a downside even to not going out as a partying as a young teenager, as a young person, and giving up the social drinking that comes with it. And I don't really want to focus on the drinking. It's what that is emblematic of.
There's no question that young people today seem to value a certain kind of monkish attitude toward health. They do fewer drugs than young people used to. They drink less alcohol than young people used to. They go to parties less. They get driver's licenses less. In all of these ways, you could say, after stat, after stat, after stat, well, it sounds like childhood today, teenagerhood today is much safer than it used to be. And in a vacuum, you could certainly imagine that this would be purely good news. The reason I don't think that it's purely good news is that this shift in behavior has coincided with an enormous, in fact, record increase in solitude. Right? The percentage of 12th graders going out with friends 2 or more times a week has declined from 80% in the 1980s to less than 60% today. Teens don't just spend more time alone. They have fewer friends. They spend less time with those friends. They go to parties less with those friends. And they're sadder, right? At the end of the day, if there was no evidence of a mental health crisis among young people, I think someone could reasonably say, Derek, it's absurd for you to care about this, right? It's actually kind of creepy for like a 30-something guy to care about the partying habits of American teens and 20s. Fair enough. But there is a mental health crisis, right? Rates of anxiety and depression and OCD and PTSD are skyrocketing for young people. And so this age of solitude that we're seeing has coincided with an age of sadness. And that's why I think it's really important to say, yes, it's good that young people aren't getting as plastered as they used to be, but at the cost, if that's coming at the cost of cutting off social connection, I'm not sure that trade-off is necessarily worth it.
But how do we then tackle the issue of the more people retreat socially, the more lonely they become, but the less socially skilled they also become, and therefore the risks of going out and socializing, of being rejected, of being humiliated, of having to introduce yourself to strangers, of having to have interaction with people who may not be interested in you, all of which for teenagers, I've had a bunch of teenagers myself, are exponentially, seem exponentially greater. How do you then get them out there? Because they're the very ones who are going to find the process of getting out there even harder.
Right. I want to provide or suggest a frame here, which is social fitness. Right? When you think of physical fitness, you could use the exact same sort of negative spiral that you just described. If someone goes to the gym less, they'll be able to lift fewer weights. If they can lift fewer weights, it'll be harder for them to go to the gym and lift weights to get stronger, which will mean that outside of the gym, they'll get weaker, which makes it harder for them to lift weights at the gym. And you can imagine a kind of negative spiral, right, of muscles atrophying as people stay away from anything that involves physical exercise. The same, I think, is arguably true of social fitness as well, right? If you feel like, or even if you're diagnosed with social anxiety, you might spend less time around other people. That means the next marginal hangout with other people is going to feel more anxious because you have less practice. And that's just going to reify the idea that you have social anxiety, which therefore makes you less likely to go out to see other people again. And you can imagine yourself somewhat trapped in a kind of psychological spiral or a psychological prison of your own making because you've decided that what you have is defining of you. You are defined by social anxiety. So I think in some ways it is really worth thinking about social fitness as akin to physical fitness. People schedule time at the gym. They tell themselves, even though I don't want to go to the gym, I don't want to get on the elliptical, I don't want to do Pilates, they still put it in their schedule. I wonder, frankly, if young people who in many ways seem incredibly ascetic and monkish should tell themselves that they should think about social fitness the same way they think about physical fitness and think of it as akin to a healthy exercise they have to keep up with if they want to be a full, healthy person.
Derek, in that kind of context, and you're pointing to some kind of path that people could follow out of this kind of crisis of loneliness and non-socializing. Talk a little bit to parents of teenagers in today's world, because my impression is that parents today, even more than when my first child became a teenager 10 years ago, 15 years ago, are more anxious about their children. They're more protective. We keep them in a bubble. We don't want them to get unsafe. We track their every movement on their cell phone. God forbid that they even, touch a drop of alcohol or a little bit of drugs or whatever it is. They're much less kind of laissez-faire than parents were in the kind of 90s and aughts, is my understanding and my kind of perception of it. So in a way, they are the worst parents for the teenagers of today who are not partying. So what would you say, and you're too young to have teenagers yourself, I'm imagining, but if you had teenagers, or if you were speaking to friends, parents who have teenagers, what would you say to them?
I'm thinking about this from the perspective of drinking. And I think there's a line in my article where I say that, of course, teen behaviors today might be good for their livers, but I'm not sure that in the broader context that they're not hanging out with people, this behavior is good for their hearts. Right? So the first thing that I would say is that to protect our kids, we sometimes need to know when to stop protecting our kids. Right? That a part of growing up is being able to, having the freedom to make the kind of mistakes that Professor Scott Galloway was talking about. That's thing number one, that I think true love requires an understanding that you cannot protect your children from everything, and that in fact too much protection is not protection, right? You are keeping your children from developing the kind of life and life experiences and exoskeleton that is necessary, I think, to be a full and flourishing adult. That's number one. Number two, I think you're absolutely right about this shift that we've seen in parenting. There was the latchkey era of the 1970s where parents were much more laissez-faire, and that coincided with a period of rising crime that I think made a lot of parents scared. And now a lot of parents in the 2000s and 2010s are the exact opposite of a latchkey parent. Rather than keep the doors unlocked and allow their kids to do, whatever kind of hitchhiking they want, instead all of the doors are locked, hitchhiking is banned, and we monitor their every move on our cell phones. If parenting can change in one direction, it can change in another direction, right? That is the nature of cultural change, right? What's the coolest kind of denim jean? Well, it's bell bottoms. No, it's skinny. No, now it's bell bottoms. No, now it's skinny. The same can be true of parenting. That the shift from latchkey parenting to intensive parenting can swing back towards something that's a little bit more lenient once we understand the costs of this era of parenting. And I think that we can see the costs all around us. Yes, young people are more cautious. They're more careful about what they put in their bodies. But that caution and care is extended to the physical world that they're simply not touching. They're not leaving their houses. They're not leaving their bedrooms. They're not going to parties. They're not making friends. They're not hanging out with the friends that they do make. And that is a kind of failure. And I think that Galloway is further right in suggesting that there's more to health than maximizing the performance of your liver on a day-to-day basis. There is a ton of evidence coming out that social connection is not only good for us cardiovascularly. There was actually just a study that came out of Northwestern finding that so-called super agers, people who in their 80s have the memory of someone in their 50s, that the thing that most correlated with super agers was social connection. It was people who had the most friends that through engagement with people in the physical world preserved their neurons in a way that was protective for dementia and Alzheimer's. So one of the bells that I'm trying to ring here is that rather than think that staying inside amounts to, or socializing less amounts to protecting our bodies, I would like us to entirely invert that, to recognize that social fitness is fitness, and being around other people might be absolutely essential to our bodies.
Okay, Derek, I'm going to go and open that bottle of wine. It's
So
Wednesday evening. It's time. Thank you very much, Derek. That was great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.